Marshmallow Man. When I was 10, my family moved to a huge house in Maryland. My dad had landed a great job, and we went from barely getting by to living in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the state. My parents were thrilled, and even though I didn't have many friends to leave behind, I was excited too. The house was amazing, but the best part of the property was the massive treehouse tucked into the woods at the back of the yard. It was unlike any treehouse I had ever seen. Built across several trees, it had staircases, multiple levels, and even windows. My brothers, Sean and Harold, and I played in it every day, pretending it was our own secret hideout. But as time went on, my brothers got older and lost interest, leaving me to explore the treehouse alone. One day, I climbed up and found a folded piece of paper sitting in the corner. It read, "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I assumed one of my brothers had left it there, maybe trying to prank me into thinking the treehouse was haunted. Excited, I grabbed a marker and wrote back, leaving a note with my name on it in the same spot. For the next few days, I rushed home from school to check the treehouse. Each time, there was a new note waiting for me. At first, the messages were fun and playful, things like, "What's your favorite color?" or "Do you like hide and seek?" But as time went on, the questions got stranger. What time do you usually play outside? What do you eat for breakfast? Which window in your house is your bedroom? I didn't think much of it at first. I still believed it was my brothers messing with me, so I answered every question. But then, I found a note that made my skin crawl. "What do your pajamas smell like?" That was when I realized something was wrong. I stormed inside and confronted my brothers, but they swore they weren't behind the notes. They laughed at me, saying I was making it up. I got so frustrated that I started crying, but I knew they were lying. Someone had to be doing this, and if it wasn't them... That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a tapping sound at my window. I froze. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I pulled my blanket over my head, too scared to move. I told myself it was just tree branches, but I knew there were no trees near my window. The next morning, I hesitated before pulling back the curtain. When I finally did, my breath caught in my throat. Dozens of marshmallows were taped to the outside of my window. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a joke. Someone had been outside my room in the middle of the night. I was furious. My brothers had taken this prank way too far. I decided I was going to catch them in the act. That night, I pretended like I hadn't noticed the marshmallows and went to bed as usual. But I stayed awake, waiting. Then, just past midnight, the tapping started again. I jumped out of bed and yanked the curtains open, ready to catch them. But it wasn't my brothers. Standing outside my window was a man. His yellowed eyes locked onto mine, his rotting teeth forming a twisted smile. His skin was pale and leathery, stretched thin over his skull. He had patchy, wiry hair clinging to his scalp, and his breath fogged up the glass. I screamed. My parents came running, but by the time they got to my room, the man was gone. The police searched the property, combing through the yard and the treehouse. They even questioned our neighbors, but no one knew who the man was. They found the stack of notes I had collected and took them as evidence, but nothing ever came of it. My parents forbade me from playing in the treehouse again, and honestly, I had no desire to go near it anyway. Years later, I moved out, but my parents still live in that house. Every time I visit, I can't help but stare at the treehouse, half expecting to see a note waiting for me. Or worse, to see him staring back. The Boy in the Woods. When my son Luke was 8 years old, I built him a treehouse in our backyard. It wasn't just some flimsy wooden platform nailed to a tree. It had real walls, a roof, and a proper staircase leading up to the entrance. I wanted him to have a space of his own, a little retreat where he could play safely. Our house sat at the end of a quiet dead-end street, bordered by dense woods. It was peaceful, private, the kind of place where neighbors kept to themselves. From our bedroom window, I had a perfect view of the treehouse. I couldn't see inside, but I could always keep an eye on the entrance. At first, Luke played in the treehouse like any kid would. He'd bring up toys, snacks, and spend hours up there. Then one day he started talking about an imaginary friend named Jake. At first, my wife Christy and I thought nothing of it. Kids have imaginary friends all the time. But Luke was never the type. He was independent, adventurous, and never needed to invent playmates before. When we asked him about Jake, he acted strangely. He said Jake was shy and didn't like being talked about. He also told us Jake only played with him in the treehouse, never in the house, never anywhere else. That struck me as odd. Over time, Luke started spending more and more time up there. He stopped bringing toys, though. He would just sit inside the treehouse for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening. One day, he came home with a black eye. I immediately asked what happened. He hesitated, looking at the floor, before mumbling, "Jake got mad at me." My stomach dropped. I knelt down and told him to tell me the truth. Had one of the neighborhood kids hit him? Had he fallen? But he just shook his head and repeated, "I told Jake I didn't want to play today. He got mad." That night, I made the decision. No more treehouse. The next morning, I climbed up to see what was inside, just to make sure Luke wasn't keeping something up there. What I found made my blood run cold. Scattered on the floor were dirty socks and sneakers, but they weren't Luke's. They weren't his older brother's either. We had donated all his old shoes years ago. Next to them were empty food wrappers, utensils, even dirty plates. Someone had been living in the treehouse. On the walls, someone had drawn animals, a fox, a bear, a deer. But one image stood out to me, a giant spider, that its face scribbled out completely. I immediately climbed down and asked Luke where the shoes and food came from. He hesitated, then whispered, "Jake is forgetful. He leaves things behind." That night, as I stared out the window at the treehouse, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was Luke, but then I realized it wasn't him. A frail, sickly-looking boy was climbing down the wooden steps. His clothes were tattered, and he moved like he hadn't eaten in days. I threw open the back door and yelled for him to stop, but the second he saw me, he bolted into the woods. I chased after him, but he was unnaturally fast. Within seconds, he vanished into the trees. We called the police. They searched the woods, knocked on every neighbor's door. No missing children had been reported. When they questioned Luke, he told them something that still haunts me. Jake lives in the woods with his friends. He says I should come live there too. He says I'd like it better than here. The police searched the area for days, but never found anything. Luke never mentioned Jake again, and we never saw him again. Christy is convinced Jake was something unnatural. She believes he wasn't a boy at all. I don't know what to believe, but sometimes, late at night, I stare out at those dark trees and wonder if he's still watching. The man who knew when I was 12, I was at that phase where everything my parents did annoyed me. I was constantly arguing with them, getting grounded and just being in overall pain. My dad had grounded me one weekend for a bad report from my guidance counselor, something about my grades and behavior at school. In my mind, I thought they were being unfair. So, as my own little way of rebelling, I decided I wasn't going to sleep in the house that night. We had a treehouse in the backyard, built by the previous owners for their kids, and it had become a staple of my childhood. When I was younger, my brother and I would spend entire summers up there, but as I got older, it was more of a hideout, a place to be alone when I needed to cool off. That night, I grabbed some blankets, a couple of pillows, and my Nintendo DS. I wasn't supposed to be using electronics while grounded, but I figured what my parents didn't know wouldn't hurt them. I climbed up into the treehouse, set up my little sleeping area, and spent hours playing Animal Crossing until my eyes couldn't stay open anymore. I don't think I was asleep for more than a few minutes when I woke up to a voice. It was deep, a man's voice. "Tommy? Tommy, are you up there?" At first, I thought it was my dad. Maybe he'd come outside to get me, but something felt wrong. I stayed silent. My heart started pounding, and I don't know why, but I just knew I shouldn't answer. Then I heard the creaking sound of the wooden steps leading up the treehouse ladder. Someone was climbing up. I turned my head just as a shadowed figure emerged from the opening in the floor. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline of a head in the dim moonlight. He tilted his head slightly and said, "Ah, there you are." I whispered, "Dad?" but he didn't answer. He just stayed there, his head poking through the opening, unmoving. Something in my gut screamed at me that this wasn't my dad. My entire body locked up. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stood there, waiting, hoping that my eyes would adjust enough to see his face. But then, I ran. I sprinted to the tiny window of the treehouse and screamed, "Dad," at the top of my lungs. Within seconds, I saw the light in my parents' bedroom turn on. Footsteps thudded down the ladder as the man climbed back down in a hurry. My dad came bursting through the back door, yelling my name. By the time he reached the treehouse, the man was gone. I climbed down, shaking, and told my dad everything. He swore up and down that it wasn't him. My mom was already on the phone with my uncle, who was a police officer at the time. He came over that night and filed a report. But there wasn't much to go on. I never saw the man's face. I had no idea who he was. But the scariest part? He knew my name. For years after, my dad was convinced it was one of the neighbors. There was a man who lived directly across the street who always gave him a weird feeling, but there was never any proof. To this day, I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I do know one thing. I never slept in that treehouse again.